Hello, the video that you're about to watch was actually filmed over 2 years ago, just before the pandemic in 2020. We were going to celebrate the 225 anniversary of our wonderful church, and it occurred to us that it might be good to interview some of the folk who've been members for some time, who have long memories spanning 20, 30, 40, in some cases over 50 years of membership in First Presbyterian Church in Columbia. And we thought that even though it was relevant for 225, I think it's also relevant for 225 plus 2. One of the things that we experienced during the lockdown, we were shut down for 16 weeks and everyone was live streaming during that period. One of the things that we discovered during that period and when we returned was how important it is to gather together as God's people in person. There's something wonderful about live streaming, and it's very convenient, and it's a gift of God, of course, for our times. But it's also one that underlines the fact that we are estranged from one another in another sense. And coming together and fellowshipping together and singing together and praying together and worshiping together is a vital part of worship. Never before have those words in Hebrews been more relevant to me. Forsake not yourselves, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. Well, as we listen to these interviews from various members of our church, we're grateful for their willingness to contribute. You will learn and discover some of the things that are important and vital for us as a church. Things like missions, for example, things like the fellowship and the worship that is a very traditional worship style for us at First Presbyterian Church. I do hope that as you watch this video that you will discover once again what a blessing it is to be part of First Presbyterian Church, and may the Lord grant us his favor for many, many years to come.
Fred, I'm going to start with you for a moment. I know you may be in contention to be the person here the longest. How long have you been attending First Presbyterian?
Not quite the longest, but I've been here since November 1929, the time I was born, so that's a good many years.
That is a good many years.
I'm married into First Presbyterian. My wife Toddy and I were married in 1963. And we left Columbia for a couple of years and came back in 1965, and that's when I joined the church. That'd be about 55 years ago.
Well, I have come here most of my life, and I guess I was an official member in 7th grade in the communicants class, and went to Clemson for a little bit, and then when we got married, we came back.
My family's from Greenville, and I had gone up to Washington, D.C., lived up there for about 7 years. And honestly, my faith had cooled. But I knew when I moved back to Columbia that I needed to get back into a church. And it was the faithful invitation of a member of this church that invited me to join her for a Sunday service. And I heard Dr. Ferguson preach, and I knew that I had found my home.
I distinctly remember going to an 8:30 service by myself and sitting in the balcony, a little bit intimidated, but when Dr. Thomas opened the Word and he started to preach, it was like, man, I've been missing this my entire life. And then to follow that up, to go to Sunday school class and be with the college ministry and hear how David preached the Word and the depth with which he did it, it felt like home the first time I was there.
I think there is a genuine appreciation of sort of the majesty and character and holiness of God in what is talked about and taught and even experienced in a real way in the worship service.
This is a church that loves to pronounce the truth of God boldly, very in a straightforward fashion with gifted pastors and teachers expounding the Word of God. And if that is not an absolute foundation, then everything else eventually crumbles.
How long have you been in the choir?
All our life.
About 48 years.
Amazing.
Me 40 in this choir. Yeah, in this choir.
In this choir,
48
40 for me, but all of our lives.
Yeah, I know. We started
Since we were like 3 years old, I
Yep,
think, is
I'm
when we
thinking
started
three,
in
four.
children's choirs. Yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
So what choir directors have been here over that period of time?
Oh, yes.
Not many.
Not many. I mean, now you
Arpad?
came when Arpad was
Arpad?
here.
Yeah.
Well, see, my grandmother was a soprano soloist when Fred Parker
Ah,
was here, and his wife Carolyn was the director. He was the organist, and so I knew Fred very well. And then Arpad, I studied with at USC, and then that's when I came into the choir under his leadership. Then Larry Wyatt, and he is, a phenomenal musician. And then Dan Cole is the culmination of everything that I think I've ever wanted. And a music director, he is such a man of God and brings things to a new level as far as the music ministry. But he's just an accomplished singer and musician. I mean, bar none. And I think that we've all been blessed in our spiritual walks, not just musical, by his influence.
I think he could teach a turnip how to sing.
I think he could too. But one funny thing, my late husband Bob would joke with Arpad Daraj, who was a Hungarian, he was magnificent, he really was. And he was nationally known as well as internationally. Bob would come up to him and say, Arpad, I think I'm going to join the choir. And Arpad says, oh, no, we don't need any baritones, no baritones. Because I had told him that Bob couldn't sing. And Bob just would howl, and he would try to get Arpad in the corner, and he thought Bob was serious. But anyway, those are some fun times.
Rhoda, I think that your family had a special tie to Ron Miller.
Yes.
That needs to be shared. Tell us
Well,
about that.
we affectionately called him Ronnie. And my father was in the Air Force and was stationed in Blytheville, Arkansas when I was, I guess, 5th through 9th grade. And they joined the First Presbyterian Church and were tenor and alto soloists. Ronnie was the youth choir director, and so he was my choir director. And he also was the organist. He was magnificently talented. And when Fred Parker announced his retirement, my grandmother, who had heard Ronnie play, and my parents arranged an audition, and they loved him, and he was their first choice. And it was just so neat to see how the Lord's hand was in that, sending us to Blytheville, Arkansas, which was just 3 shakes from nowhere. And it was to get Ronnie. It was to get Ronnie, and we know that.
What all did that involve, directing weddings at First Presbyterian? You kind of started it when I was married in 83.
Yeah, right.
There was no one. So how did you develop that, and what all was involved with it?
It was a wonderful ministry. I loved it. And it didn't matter how closely we planned, funny things always happened. Either there was not enough bouquets, or the dress didn't fit, or one time the bride absolutely fainted giving her vows.
Oh, mercy.
And they lifted her up and put her on the front pew, and she finished her vows. And when the benediction came along, she got up and went down the aisle smiling. And she actually was the daughter of the minister.
Who was that?
Dr. Connect.
Oh, that's hysterical.
So it was Amy that fit. But another funny thing that happened is that all the bridesmaids had gone down the aisle. Everything was going perfectly. And the matron of honor was the mother of the ring bearer. And everything was the little boy ring bearer. And so all of a sudden, in time for him to get in line to go down, he said, "I got to go to the bathroom. I need to go to the men's room." And we said, "Hurry, just hurry." So he hurries.
Were people walking down the aisle?
The bridesmaids had already gone down the aisle, and the matron of honor, who was the mother, was waiting to go down the aisle. And so he gets in there, and he turns the doorknob, and it comes off in his hand. He is locked in the restroom.
What did you do?
He's screaming to the top of his voice. The mother's crying. She can't go down the aisle. I'm not going down the aisle without him. And we brought 2 or 3 people in from the congregation to try to get the door unlocked.
From the back of the church?
No, we went down and brought them out. And the little boy's still screaming. You could hear him screaming. Anyway, the 4th or 5th person that walked in was George Floyd. He had some type of a thing that he could get that door open.
Unlock it.
He unlocked it from the front. And so the little boy came out smiling.
And went down the aisle?
And went down the aisle with the matron of honor.
Then did the wedding keep going?
And it kept going.
Talk to us a little bit about the early years of the sports ministry and how it evolved.
Well, I guess it began along about 1990, about that time. Our daughter was around 12 years old, and she got interested in basketball. We didn't have a basketball team for young girls at that time here at our church. And I asked for permission to create the first girls team. I only coached the girls for a couple of years, but then I moved from that to one Saturday morning being at the YMCA and sitting beside Mark Ross, watching senior boys play basketball. And Mark told me, he said, "You need to be coaching those boys." And I said, "Well, if you ask me to do that next year, I'll do it." So he asked me, and that began an 11-year run of coaching senior high boys basketball here at the church. And while I was doing that, a young fellow came over here from First Baptist by the name of Jimmy Easterby. And when Jimmy came, he showed a great interest in basketball, and he and I became very, very good friends. And today, based on his leadership since that time, there are now over 27 churches involved in the basketball ministry and over 160 basketball teams. And in each one of the games, someone gives a devotional and a prayer, usually Jimmy if it's here at our church. And it's given us an opportunity to share the gospel through sports ministry.
Talk to me a little bit about your time working with children at First Presbyterian Church.
It began in a volunteer role in the Sunday school program and stayed at that level for a good while, but I did have some concerns about the facilities we had for the children, and I decided at one point that I wanted to write a letter to the session and just give my observation and ask maybe for some upgrades with some furniture and things. And I believe they took it to heart because it wasn't long after that they asked me to serve on the search committee for our Minister of Christian Education, who turned out to be Mark Ross. The session decided to create a position of Director of Nursery and Preschool Ministries, and Mark encouraged me to apply for that job, and I did. I was the one they chose.
And the rest is history.
And the rest is history.
Tell me a little bit about Bible school at First Pres and those years where you got it off the ground and brought an energy and passion to that ministry.
Well, it involved many, many phone calls. And that was something I had to really work with at first, getting a volunteer base to work from. And I found that the families in the church did want to be involved in the children's ministry.
Tell me about your day camp experiences.
It was in place of VBS for the older kids. I think they still did VBS for like preschool, kindergarten, and then the older elementary kids went out to the old like YMCA place and swam in the lake, rode the bus out there.
We borrowed a school bus from one of the schools, and I drove the school bus out there. I'll tell you a story about that, because we would leave here in the morning, and we'd come back about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we'd eat lunch out there and have classes to play sports. Came back, and we had an extra mother. No child. We had an extra mother, and we couldn't figure what had happened. And so we covered this campus good looking for her. And Ann Harley drove up with her and that child in the car. And it was amazing because we just, you know, if you have an extra child, there's no problem. The mother's probably late. But when you have an extra mother, you have a real serious problem.
Leanna, you worked in the trenches with the women's ministries for years. Talk to us a little bit about that
It was
walk.
a little over 20 years, and it was just a wonderful time. Part of my job was Christian ed, the other part was pastoral care, so I did visitation, Bible studies, luncheons, conferences, you name it. It was a great time. I loved working with all our pastors, and it was such a privilege to work with the ladies.
Dorothy, tell me a little about your work in our church, maybe the women of the church. You've been involved with that?
Served on the board of the Women of the Church, taught Sunday school, and was involved in the Bible school, summer Bible school program, and co-chaired that. And then, of course, cooked cheese grits for the men's Bible study, so we consider that a ministry.
Well, we got started with Bible study that meets on Fridays and has been meeting on Fridays since 1985.
At your home?
At our house, yes. We had decided ahead of time when we were moving from Atlanta here that if the Lord allowed, we'd like to have a home that would accommodate that. And as it turned out, that turned out to be the case. We ended up with Mark Ross starting the Bible study and teaching it, and has continued to teach it since 1985.
What Sunday school class do you attend?
I go to the Gateway class.
What's that been like?
That has been wonderful. So that class started, I think, about 5 years ago. Dan Cannon and William Cason founded it initially, and we were a pretty small group. We had about 20 or 30 people, but God has blessed, and it's grown steadily since then.
What class do you attend, Earl?
Timothy class. And Dr. Joe Tabor, a friend of ours, came up with the idea that we should have a class with no teacher.
Yes, sir.
And he said we just study the Bible as a group.
The fun thing about the church was if you had an idea, you could take it, and generally they'd work with you. Mary Wells Bowers and I taught an aerobics class years ago in the basement in this building, and that was just a fun time of fellowship. So many other people come to mind, teaching fourth grade with Jean Craig, working with Neal Mathias in her women's Sunday school class. We did, I think it's called Christianity Explored with Ann and Neal. Just the young women's circle. There just have been so many fun, but it's interesting. Each time there's a name and a person and a connection.
Birthdays have always been important to me. They were important to my wife. I received a list one day that had the birthdays of some people in the congregation that I knew, and I just decided I would call them and wish them a happy birthday. And at first I started just calling the people in the congregation that I knew, and one day my dear wife said, you know, it might be a good idea if we could call everybody. So we began, I guess it's 25, 30 years ago, to call everybody. And yes, there have been some interesting stories, some stories of gratitude and some stories of people who needed assistance and help and this kind of thing. So we just met lots of wonderful people, and children enjoyed the call, so we're going to keep it up.
Churches are very vulnerable to divisions and splits, and for whatever reason, God has chosen to really guard and protect, not without tensions, the unity and the peace of this congregation.
Starting in 1981, things were heating up about church union with the Northern Presbyterian Church. But during that same period of time, we had a fire in our sanctuary. Dr. Wardlow became our interim pastor for 15 months after Dr. McClure resigned. And by the way, we also had a search committee going on at the same time all this other stuff was going on. Walker Clark was chairman of the search committee that we called Dr. Glenn Connect later on in '83. But Dr. Wardlaw deserves a lot of praise. He was the right man at the right time. He had the demeanor and the poise and the calmness but firmness that was necessary to lead us through this process, because emotions were very, very high. And we found out that, you know, the ARP, their theology is very much like ours as far as the authority of Scripture, Westminster Confession, things like that. And I mean, it's probably the closest denomination we could have ever found to match the old PCUS that we knew.
But we didn't realize it was a choice at our first go-around.
That's right.
And how has that worked out?
It's worked out very well. I think we made a good choice.
One of the blessings and privileges has been to work individually with each of the senior pastors over the 4 decades that we have been part of this church. Dick DeWitt, John R. DeWitt, was serving in Michigan, and the search committee wanted to contact him. They asked me, so I looked on the internet and found 7 John DeWitts in Michigan, in Grand Rapids. I called the first one on the list. A very pleasant southern voice of a lady answered the phone, and she said, when I asked for, is Pastor John DeWitt available? She said, yes, he's sitting right here, just a moment. And that was my initial conversation with Dick and Jane DeWitt.
I will say he really got us going in the right direction. And I've heard many others say, and I agree with them, that if it hadn't been for Dr. DeWitt, we would not have had Dr. Ferguson or Derek Thomas at this point.
Where do you see us going over the next 25 years?
I think a strong stand for the continuation of corporate worship with obviously a call to worship and a confession of faith and a statement of faith through the creed. We are a creedal church. We are Presbyterians. We do believe what we believe for the reasons that we think it's founded on Scripture. And if we continue unabashedly to pursue what we believe, but with a welcoming and outreaching ministry to young professionals, young families, college students, etc., then this city and this church, I believe, will continue to thrive together.
The truth is proclaimed in a loving way, full of truth and grace from this pulpit every single Sunday. And so I think that is something that people of my generation and generations behind me are looking for. We want to know where we belong, why we were created, what purpose do we have in this life. And we know that that's only going to be answered through the good news of the gospel. And so I think that it's the gospel faithfulness of this church that will continue to bring young people for generations yet to come.